Hello everyone and welcome to the Star Wars The Old Republic Nahut boss fight guide in veteran mode. Nahut is the third boss in the Gods from the Machine operation, which is the 10th operation in the game's history. It's a really fun fight. If you've been through Tithe and Avela and Esni, Nahut's a bit of a different story. It's a little more of a structured fight with several distinct phases that are each very different from the other. In veteran mode particularly, this fight requires a lot of teamwork and coordination. Everybody has a role to play. And this fight can feel very difficult early on because, again, it is very, very structured. So if you're seeing it for the first time, sometimes you have to build up some muscle memory a little bit to know how to deal with it. But the good news is that once you kind of know how the fight works, it's very, very predictable with only a few things that are really random at all. So unlike Tithe and A&E that can occasionally be problematic just because they're somewhat random, especially Tithe, Nahut's really, really fun. It might be my favorite boss fight in Gods from the Machine. So I'm going to do everything I can to help explain everything. Now, if you've seen in my other veteran mode video guides, they tend to be very extensive. I try to cover everything. So this is going to be way longer than kind of your typical pre-fight explanation in-game would typically be. So I'm going to put chapter tags down in the description, and you can use the forward and backwards chapter to navigate through. So, if you watch this whole thing all the way through, awesome, thank you. But otherwise, feel free to navigate to the specific mechanics you need to understand that are specific to your role or your job or the pieces you want to brush up on, so that you get what you need to get through this fight and get it down to farm and get it down consistently so your team can keep progressing. So thanks for watching, and let's dive into the details here. Okay, so let's talk about Phase 1. Phase 1 is in this middle area. That much is similar to Story Mode. Unlike in Story Mode, where you could just kind of hang out in the middle and have maybe one person do the candle, there's a lot that's different in Veteran Mode because you can't stay in the middle for a variety of reasons and mechanics that are a bit different in Veteran Mode. So we'll talk about those. Let's talk about the basic structure for Phase 1, because the overall structure is the same. You're dealing damage to break his shield. That's more important, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then he starts his cast to be mobile, and then you're having the tanks are going to be kiting him around. As we'll talk about again in a moment, the distortion field that goes out, see mass distortion going out there, is much, much bigger than in story mode, so you can't just hang out in the middle because, as you'll see in a second, the bubble's just way too big. So you have to kite him around, as you can see here. Another thing that's important that you'll notice is the pins, which are kiting strategy and forms kind of how we deal with that, which I'll talk about. Then you also see the shield around the boss and people getting these yellow stacks. That's also a new mechanic in hard mode. And so we basically are kiting him around the room to drop these distortion fields. And you're also having to deal with the candle because that's much, much more important, which we'll also talk about. But the basic structure is kind of like you see here, where you're walking him back and forth to drop these puddles where so that it's safe for everyone to stand till you get him into the mid-80s. Then you push him, and then he resets everything, and then you break his shield again, and then you go through that cycle a second time until you get until you push him to Phase 2. So that's kind of the basic structure. So as you can see, it looks a bit different than what most folks typically would do in story mode. So we kind of have to deal with all these mechanics that for the most part we could ignore. So let's talk about these one by one and then talk about how we put that together in a cohesive strategy. Okay, so let's start by talking about the candle, and particularly how the candle's debuff applies to Nahut. So I've got up here a snippet of the description from the website around the suppression burst buff that gets put on Nahut, for those that like to read as well as hear and see, which we'll show you in a second. So the way that this works, you use the candle. It has this AoE that most people should hopefully have seen before, and if it clips Nahut, it applies this debuff that prevents him from cloaking. Now it's important to note that unlike in story mode, where if you're holding the candle or if you are in melee range of him, you can still see him, meaning that as long as you stay close to him and stay close to the tank that has aggro, you don't even really need to worry about the candle in hard mode. If this buff is not active on Nahut, he is not going to be visible to see. So you've got to make sure you pretty much have to have this thing on him continuously. And anytime he's active, you have to do this mechanic. Again, unlike in story mode, where in certain phases, like in the burn phase, you don't have to worry about it. Here, anytime he's active, we've got to keep him visible. So when you use Suppression Burst, you, the player, have a 40-second cooldown before you can use it again. But effect on Nahut, the buff here, only lasts for 16 seconds, which means at a minimum, you're going to need at least 3 players to apply 16, 16, and 16 is going to be 48 seconds, so that gives you enough coverage. For practical purposes, since that doesn't give you a lot of cushion, what I strongly recommend is that you assign 4 players to be your kind of defined candle rotation during phase 1 in the middle area, during phase 3 when half of the group is near the boss and some others are dealing with turrets, and during burn phase, ideally have the same people doing it. And you'll also need a candle rotation during phase 2 to deal with the railgun shot, which we'll talk about. Okay, so as an example, here's the way that we usually do it. So we organize our raid frame traditionally, tanks at the top, healers at the bottom. And so the way we always do it is we have 2 DPS assigned to deal with turrets. And it may vary depending on the group. In this particular group, we had 2 DPS, the 2 DPS right below the tanks, assigned to be turret hunters. And then we had the other 2 DPS and both healers basically staying at the boss. Typically, you're not going to have healers peel off to deal with turrets, and you're typically going to want about 2 DPS to be on Nahut the whole time in phase 3 to get his health where you want it to be. So this works very naturally. And so what you do is you have those 4. In this example of graphically, I've shown kind of passing it in a clockwise fashion. You can do whatever you want, from top to bottom, then left to right, or left, right, top to bottom, whatever order you want. Just make sure it's those 4. What you don't want to have happen is somebody helping with turrets that is dealing with turrets, because if they're dealing with the candle and turrets, they run off to deal with turrets, then the rotation gets mixed up, and that's bad. The other thing is whether or not to involve tanks. I typically don't recommend doing that because Nahut can actually steal the candle when you pass it. So if you do involve a tank in the candle rotation, it's important that you watch your positioning so that whoever they're going to pass to knows to stand to the side of the boss rather than behind him, so that you're not passing the candle through Nahut. If you try to pass it through him, he'll intercept it, which means he'll hold on to it until he's able to cloak again, and then he'll drop it, which means he will disappear. Somebody's going to have to pick it up, which could be some rant who you don't necessarily know who that's going to be, and then also have to then use the candle. So that's really clunky. We really like having 2 deeps and 2 heals do it because they're all behind the boss, so you don't have to worry about Nahut stealing it, and they're always going to be near the boss, so they're always going to be proximate to him. And it's nice, easy rotation. I like that a lot. Okay, so a couple other ways just to be aware of how to kind of keep track of what's going on here is anytime someone uses the candle, they get this candle suppressed debuff applied to them, the one that looks kind of like the face with a glowy light where the eyes would be there at the on my bar here. And that actually lasts for 16 seconds. And so this is a little weird. This is basically a debuff that prevents the player from benefiting from certain passive effects of the candle that aren't really super relevant to the mechanics. But you do get this debuff, and so another way to watch for kind of when to use the candle. So if you're the one getting the candle, how quickly should you use it? You don't want to use it as soon as someone passes it to you generally. So when do you know where to use it? Well, one way to do it is you can watch the person's bar that passed it to you, and once you see that ability bar a little over halfway counted down, that's about when you want to pass it. Because if you have 4 people doing it, that's 16 seconds of cumulative potential duration if you passed it, like if you used it right as the debuff was going to expire. So that's 64 seconds out of 40. So that means if you wait till the previous person's debuff's about 2/3 of the way down, that's going to be about 10 seconds or so that he's been suppressed. So there's about 5 to 6 seconds left. And so that's a good time to use it again and to pass it. So some people love this approach. They'll even focus target the person that's passing it to them to make it even easier to watch at the top of their screen. Some people love this option. It's not my preference, but it does work really well once you get the hang of knowing about how far down's appropriate to use your candle and then pass it to the next person. Okay, so the way that I actually prefer to do it, this is a zoomed in screenshot where you can see Nahut's bar. And so if you look on his buff bar, you'll see the suppression burst buff. It's the top right most buff. that looks just like the ability and the graphic I showed you a moment ago. Is I watch for that, because that's the debuff. As soon as that goes away, then Nahut will uncloak. Actually, the buff next to it, just to the left, the kind of red, kind of almost X-looking shape, that's actually the buff that prevents him from cloaking. But the effect that applies it is the one at the top right, the suppression burst. And so what I usually do is watch that bar. About the only time I might not do this is if I were a healer, where Nahut wouldn't generally be my main target, in which case I'd probably focus target him. In that scenario, I might do it differently. But for DPS or tanks, if you're part of the candle rotation, generally probably shouldn't be, but DPS or tanks, your main targets should always be Nahut anyway. And so that's what I like to use, because I'm already kind of keeping an eye on mechanics and rotation, and so it's just kind of right there. As an ops lead, I find this very helpful as well. When I'm doing other things, I focus target Nahut, and that's my metric. If I'm the one as the ops lead who needs to call out the candle rotation for folks that maybe haven't done it before, this is the way I prefer to watch it, because I usually, unless I'm a healer, I'm not usually watching the ops frame too closely. So I'm not watching players' individual debuffs, so I like this as an option as well. Okay, so let's watch the opening phase just from the perspective of the candle rotation, because again, this is the thing that'll probably take the most practice to get the hang of early on. It won't take you that long. So it's important to note, once you pick up the candle, Nahut's not actually there, so you don't want to use it at first. You want to wait until you get this notification right there, Singularity Generator Startup Initiated. That means he's now present, and now you should use the candle. You'll notice Jason here used it. You can see the debuff on his bar. You can also see the buff bar on his target, on Nahut's target. So now it's getting low, so now we need to use the candle, or he's going to cloak. And so there, we used it again. And so now Arthuruk used it, so now we've used it a second time, and you can see both of those ticking down on either the ops frame or Nahut's bar. And so it's about time to use it again, hopefully. And you have to watch out when he's moving. It has a big area of effect. And so we used it again. And so now Kexel, one of our healers, used it, and you just keep going through that rotation. It's important to talk and communicate, especially if you use it early or whatever happens. And so there we keep him suppressed. Another good tip is make sure that as soon as you use the candle, your immediate priority is to then pass the candle to whoever's next. Don't wait, because there may be times, there probably will be times, when he disappears because someone loses track of something, and it's important that whoever has the candle can use it immediately. So if someone forgets to use it, someone uses it too fast, whatever, there's plenty of cushion with a 4-player rotation. So you get the candle, then you watch the buff bar, keep doing what you're doing, keep healing, keep DPSing, keep tanking, and then when it's time to use it, like right now, you clip it. So there, he disappeared. We were a tiny bit late, but it's okay because they were ready. And then you use it, and then you immediately pass it to the next player. And you're going to keep doing that throughout the entire op. You don't have to worry about the suppression buff during phase 2, as we'll talk about, but you do still need to worry about passing the candle. So pretty much, if you're on candle duty, that's like your main job throughout like the entire fight. The good news is, if you're a DPS dealing with candles or a healer, there aren't a ton of other specific mechanics for you other than just positioning. So the good news is, if you're dealing with candle, most of the other kind of weird boss-specific mechanics you won't have to generally contend with. So it's kind of a nice division of responsibility, where both tanks and 2 DPS have a variety of things to deal with, and then the other 4 primarily just have to deal with the candle. So anyway, let's continue. Okay, so now let's talk about a couple mechanics. We're going to go through them pretty quickly because they all kind of inform the movement in phase 1. So let's start with Mass Distortion Field. This mechanic exists in story mode, but it is different in hard mode. The first thing you need to understand is that it lasts longer. It lasts 60 seconds in hard mode, so there will still be circles up as you move through each phase, so positioning is important, and the circles are quite a bit bigger. So you may recall that in story mode, the way you would want to position the fight is you'd want to put circles kind of around that inner circle area, but that they were small enough that people could still stack in the middle and be safe. Here the circles are so big that there's really no way to keep people in the middle, just from this mechanic, but for other reasons also. So we've got this Mass Distortion Field we need to deal with. We can't drop it in the middle, so we've got to get out there in the rest of that inner area. So the other thing as well is Inertial Distortion. So what actually happens is the boss casts Mass Distortion Field that puts on this Inertial Distortion debuff. It's the same graphic, so I apologize if that's confusing. This is the debuff that counts down until when you actually drop the circle. Now in story mode, this functions basically like Electronet, so the graphic is very appropriate in that if you move, it deals damage. In story mode, it does not deal very much damage, so it's kind of not a big deal if you need to still move a little bit. You may need to use like a movement ability to help move quickly enough. Now in veteran mode, this is very, very different because it hurts really, really, really badly if you try to move. Unless you have like Shadow Resilience, Assassin Force Shroud to just completely ignore the damage, or a similarly strong defensive ability like if you have the emergency power set bonus as a Vanguard Power Tech tank, that might work as well. Otherwise, you really can't move. Once you get the Inertial Distortion debuff, once the boss casts Mass Distortion, you just have to stand there, which means you need to be positioned where you want that circle to be before the cast goes out, because if you get it in a bad spot, either people are going to have to work around it, or you're going to have to just about kill yourself trying to get repositioned. So positioning and positioning in advance is very important. Right? Another mechanic that you saw and we'll see again in a moment is Nahut has a reflect shield around him during phase 1, which means you have to be within this. It's about a 10 meter-ish, maybe a little less, but around 10 meter radius. If you're outside of that, you cannot deal damage to Nahut, which means you have to be inside the shield, which means we know we have to pull the boss out of the middle to get him positioned for Mass Distortion. But the DPS at least have to follow because they have to be inside this shield. So not only do the tanks have to go run around dealing with fire and mines, but the DPS do as well, which makes it even more dangerous. And so as if adding insult to injury, not only do you as a DPS have to follow Nahut, dodging fire, dodging mines, being inside this shield, but as you're inside this shield, you're going to build up this Rending Cloud debuff. So this is a buff. It's both a buff on Nahut during phase 1, and it's a debuff, effectively a dot applied to players as well. Every second you're standing inside the shield, you're going to pick up stacks of Rending Cloud that deals damage, and then it falls off after a few seconds once you leave the shield. And so typically, I've noted here in hard mode, veteran mode, my experience has been most healers generally don't have too much trouble handling that damage until you get to in that 15 to 20 range. Once you get above 20, it starts to be really, really problematic unless you have like a really powerful self-heal, like if you're a Vigilance Guardian, Vengeance Jug, and you have Focused or Enraged Defense up, and you can hit that to help heal through some of that damage. To stay in a little longer, that's okay. Usually the DPS check on this phase isn't super tough, so it's something you have to be mindful of. If you're a DPS, you have to get out of the circle. A little bit like Malifar, where you be in the circle for a little while, then you know you have to get out to keep damage manageable, is kind of what's going on here. Okay, so this is not a really great quality screenshot, but just a quick freeze frame look at the size of the shield. So it's not super huge, as you can see. So you have to be relatively close to the boss as you kind of follow him around the room. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. Last but not least, in this kind of phase 1, all these positioning movement mechanics, we've got the Distortion mine. So there's a couple of things that happen here if you clip one of these mines. The first thing that happens is you get this Distortion mine incapacitation, which stuns you, and it applies 2 different debuffs in veteran mode. One of those is unique to veteran mode, which is Distortion Shock. So a couple things are going to happen, all of them very bad. If you hit a Distortion mine, you're going to be stunned, and you're going to get this Snared Prey buff, which effectively works like a taunt because it lasts for the same duration. Nahut's going to you're stunned, which means you can't use most abilities, and Nahut's going to come smack you in the face for 6 seconds. And in veteran mode, unlike story mode, the tank can't just taunt him back. So there's really nothing that can be done. So if that happens, you better hope you're high health. You better hope the healers are able to burst heal you, and you better hope the boss isn't about to do his Energized Slice, which is his big, really heavy-hitting conal, or else you're just gonna die. So it's very bad. The second thing that also happens is if you do clip a mine, you get this Distortion Shock debuff for 60 seconds. So you hit one mine, okay, fine. Hopefully you survive. If you do survive, but then you clip a second mine, you just instantly die. So the story here is mines are terrible. We want to avoid them if at all possible. So the question then becomes, putting all this together, is there a way for us to kite Nahut around so that the tanks can get positioned to drop Mass Distortion in a safe position, and that the DPS can follow, ducking in and out of the shield to deal with the debuff? to deal damage to Nahut to push him, while also dodging these really, really dangerous mines? And the answer is yes, there's actually a pretty easy way. Okay, so here's the map of this area overlaid with some graphics. So as you'll see, the white kind of dashed circles are the pins and mines. Now, you won't necessarily get them in all of these positions, because when the boss is doing that prepare the field channel at the beginning, which that's all he's doing is placing these mines. So if you let him finish that cast, that channel, then he'll lay them all here. The sooner you break that channel, the fewer of these mines you're going to get. The key thing to note here is that they are primarily centered around the long, narrow fire vents that you should be able to see here, but that there are generally not any place directly on top of or behind the short vents. So the basic tanking strategy here is you literally take Nahut through the short vents. And so the first tank will go, usually the way we do this, because we know that in phase 2 we're going to go to the northwest part of the map. That's where we're going to be dealing with the ads, and we're going to be dealing with the consoles. And so what we usually do is we start by having the tanks go southeast and northwest. And so usually if I'm tanking it, in most of these videos I'll be tanking, I take him at first, I build up aggro on him when he first spawns, and then I taunt him, and then I run directly southeast. I run through the short fire vent, and I go right up against that big red pink barrier around the inner area, and I stand right next to one of those power generators, and I'll burn my single taunt. As I run out, I'll kind of stay just within range to clip him with my AoE taunt usually to make sure I hold him, and then usually I'll even throw out my single taunt as that expires. So I'll use my triple taunt to force him to follow me out there and get positioned so that I drop the first mass distortion at the southeast, and then as soon as I get the mass distortion debuff, the other tank taunts and then takes him northwest to drop at the outer corner, and then we go back and forth along that southeast to northwest arc, dropping circles just adjacent to each other. We rarely need more than 4. With Veteran's Edge and 6.0, oftentimes we only need 2 or maybe 3. And then he jumps to the middle and resets. And this time we go northeast and southwest, doing the exact same thing. In this fashion, as long as DPS and healers follow directly along that same path, nobody has to worry about mines. So the only thing you really have to worry about is don't stand in fire. And for DPS, make sure to get out of the shield when those Rending Cloud dots get too high. And usually based on this pattern, the circles in the northwest typically have disappeared by the time we're through the second cycle. And so when we go to phase 2, we've got a nice clear path to move over to phase 2 to deal with those mechanics. So we've talked about all of phase 1. Let's see it live now that we've talked about the mechanics. Okay, so here we go. Just like before, we're going to ready check. And so based on the way I'm orienting my camera, I'm going to be taking him again to the side. It's basically every time you see through the short vents, they always point to one of the generators. So you're basically going to go through the short vent, and you're going to cuddle up right next to one of those kind of transformer stations. So there's the boss. I'm just wailing on him, just dealing damage, trying to build up aggro while we break the shield. The better we break the shield, the sooner we do that, the fewer mines. Again, I'm just building aggro, and now as soon as he's mobile, I'm going to throw out my taunt. I'm going to start to pull him. I'll use my ranged force pull. I'll usually pop my AoE taunt to make sure I hold him, and what I'm watching for is the mass distortion. So there it is. So I'm not going to move. There's energized slice. Now the other tank grabs him, and I'm just going to stand here and wait for mass distortion. I don't want to move. I'm on a sin, so I could if I had to. So now that's it. I'm going to knock back a mine, but as we're walking on this path, I'm going to tank taunt the boss, and now I'm going to take him. And again, I'm watching out for those fire vents. That's the one risk to this strategy, but usually the circle's big enough, and I'm standing just outside the mass distortion field. There it is again. You'll notice about the time you ping-pong him back and forth, right as I drop this puddle, it'll be time. So there he disappears briefly. So then mass distortion goes out, and then within a couple of seconds, he's going to put mass distortion on the other tank. So for the most part, you kind of keep him moving continuously. And so now here he goes to the middle, and we're going to reset. And then I'm going to do the same thing, except now I'm just kind of pivoting 90 degrees. I'm putting a tactical marker here to let the team know this is what I'm going to do. This video is actually from when we were still progging it, so we were still kind of working out our strat. The fire hurts a little bit, but it won't one-shot you, so it's not a big deal to run through it as long as you just don't hang out, or else the barbecue is you. Same deal. I'm going to get positioned early, drop mass distortion, taunt, tank swap on mass distortion. right after it, and then you just kind of keep ping-ponging back and forth, and easy peasy. The only other thing is, again, DPS need to watch out their stacks. If you've been watching, for the most part, people have been swapping around 15, 16 stacks. The way he's ping-ponging back and forth also means that when he's walking out of the inner circle, if you're at a 15, 16, 18 stack, sometimes you just hang out in the middle and let him walk by you, and then when he comes back to you, he'll the stacks will have dropped off. And that's it. Okay, so now let's move on to talking about Phase 2. Phase 2 is a bit simpler, but it is still has some nuances that are really important in hard mode. So again, we're just dealing with Nahut. We'll typically push to him in the low 70s. I think we push here at 71. And then everyone's heading northwest. Now, if you're the tank that had the boss, you need to make sure if you have mass distortion, you wait, like I am here. Otherwise, you'll kill yourself by moving. But once we get positioned here, our goal is from this point on, we want to stay out of the middle because we see that red line that'll deal damage if we get sucked. Go past it, pulled into it, or run past it. Our overall goal here is to kill the power couplings to get them down to 1 HP before the generator finishes charging and before basically this last sectional platform gets charged with lightning. We also have to deal with the gravity vortex that pulls us in periodically, although that's more of an annoyance, and we also have these extermination droids. However, the main mechanic, really the only mechanic of real substance, is Nahut sitting back there sniping at people with his railgun. In story mode, you kind of can mostly ignore it. You have somebody stand out, and a tank can take almost all of them. Maybe you have the tank swap the candle back and forth, and that's it. But in veteran mode, it's quite a bit more difficult. So you can see here people standing out. You can see the white debuff. Let's talk about those mechanics and how it informs the strategy, because it is a little bit different. Not a lot different, a little different, but those nuances are very important, and that you have to be coordinated in this phase. Okay, so the first thing, let's just to be really clear, because sometimes this can be confusing if you don't notice in story mode, although it's true in story mode also. Nahut is going to attempt to Railgun Snipe, that's the name of the ability, the player who has the candle. Now you can see who that is in a couple of ways. You can see in this screenshot, you can see Nahut over way off in the distance behind the black hole targeting us. There's a red laser beam that connects Nahut to the player that has the candle. There's a red laser beam is the main and easiest, most obvious way to do it. You also see there's a buff in my bar. It looks kind of like a red background with that kind of white-orange fire beam that denotes I'm being targeted by it. The key thing to note is once he begins to target you, you can actually go ahead and pass the candle, and he's still going to snipe you. So it's basically a cast on his part, and once he starts it, he's going to finish it. The other thing to note is you can't LOS this. So I'm hiding behind the generator. I'm not doing that because that really, hiding behind something helps. It doesn't, at least for Nahut. What it does, though, is separate me from the group. You notice everybody is over to the left dealing with the power couplings. So you have melee DPS and tanks that are dealing damage to the power coupling. So you don't want them to have to move away from the player. So the player with the candle comes and stands behind the generator like you see here. That way they're away from the group. Because the other thing that's important is the Railgun Snipe is a conal, which means anybody within I don't know the exact distance, but let's say within a couple of meters in either direction of you along that path is also going to take damage, and they're going to get the debuff. So let's talk about the debuff, because that's the main thing that's different in veteran mode. Okay, so here's a screenshot of the debuff itself and the description. So in story mode, Railgun Trauma per stack reduces healing received by 5%, maximum health by 5%, and increases damage taken from Railgun Snipe by 50%. So here everything's basically multiplied by a factor of 6. So each stack you get healing received reduced by 30, maximum health by 30, and the next stack does, the next attack of Railgun Snipe does quadruple damage. So it basically means that you can't, no player can survive multiple attacks without using a defensive ability that lets them cheese it entirely. So like, if you time Mad Dash or, some of those abilities. I don't believe Saber Reflect works on this because it is a conal based ability. There are maybe a handful of abilities that would let you cheese this kind of damage, but as a practical rule, you shouldn't really need to do that. So what effectively happens is that your strategy should be nobody takes more than one attack, and you need to get everyone separated, because if the whole group has Railgun Trauma, then whoever gets Railgun Snipe next, whoever has the candle, is either going to have to use a really powerful defensive cooldown and hope it works and they survive, or they're just going to die. So that's the key. You want to rotate it through. The debuff does last quite a while. which means that in general there'll be 6 typically casts that go out during that phase, and so you'll want usually 5 people or so is enough, because usually the first person's able to maybe take the last one. So you'll need at least 4 and more typically 5. The way we usually do this is we just have our regular candle rotation. So whoever has the candle is the first person to stand out, and then they go through that rotation, and typically will identify one of the tanks or one of the other DPS that's on turret duty to take the candle just for purposes of that mechanic. So let's see this live. Okay, so first let's see how phase 2 goes, and here's an example where actually things don't go perfectly, because again, it's a conal. So if the person's a little bit slow getting out of the group, multiple people can get the debuff, and if too many people get the debuff, you get in trouble. So here we're going to see that happen. Everyone transitions here, dealing with power couplings, dealing with ads, dot spreading, all that fun stuff. Whoever has the candle needs to get out of the group, and in this case, you're going to see they're a little slow. So there we have a player getting targeted, and now they're going to, I think we actually get the first one, and here's a cast coming in, and it clips several people. So now 2 people got clipped, so we have 3 people with the debuff. What do we do? Well, no problem. We have voice comms, so we just call out who's going to take it next, and you just make sure to call out, say, I'm giving it to Merlin. And so here in a second, you're going to see I get the candle. I'm not part of the rotation, but I'm going to step out back here. I'm just going to wait. I'm going to take the hit. Does a lot of damage. I'm a little bad here in that I stand too close to the lightning, so I almost die. Shame on me. And you just keep rotating through. So not a big deal. Again, you just got to communicate. You just got to know whoever has the candle gets out of the group, and you'll get through this no problem. And again, real quick before we move on, you see here just kind of a graphical indicator with some of the debuffs, and hopefully is somewhat helpful. Again, we move to the northwest. It doesn't have to be a tank in story mode. The simplest way to do it is usually to have a tank. So this graphic's actually more from the perspective of story mode. In hard mode, you can't have tanks just do it the whole time, because they'll die too. Maybe they could take a second one if they pop some really strong defensives, but as a practical matter, you just go back and forth, and whoever gets it passes the candle immediately, and then that player, whoever gets it, then calls out. So you just call it on comms, hey, I'm giving the candle to so-and-so, then that person knows, oh, I need to get out of the group, and no problem. Okay, so now let's talk about phase 3. So phase 3, we finished killing the power couplings. The lightning comes on here, but they're already destroyed, so yay, we don't die. And now we're going to have a few seconds. Remember, Nahut's on the far side of the room. He's stealth, so you want to wait. Usually the tank that's probably going to have aggro is going to want to move up a little bit, and you kind of wait, and as soon as you start taking damage, then you go ahead and use the candle. Now again, from this point onward, we still have to go through our candle rotation. We're watching the debuff. You can see on Nahut's bar, he's got that Suppression Burst debuff. Got to have that rotation so that you're using the candle to keep him visible. The main thing here is tank positioning, which we'll talk about. You can see here we're dropping puddles. We're dropping 2 puddles on each side of the generator station, with the DPS and healers standing behind Nahut, kind of with their backs to the generator station, which is really nice because the boss's cleave, that energized slice, is really, really nasty. And what's all the tanks are going to do, the DPS and healers that are assigned to the boss are literally just going to kind of stay positioned there. After we drop 4 puddles, we move him over to the next generator, and everyone repositions, and that's it for everybody that's not dealing with turrets. Now that we're going to talk a little bit about the kiting and all that stuff, and then we'll talk about the turrets, but that's really it apart from dealing with turrets. Now the key thing is you cannot transition through this phase without dealing with the turrets appropriately, and if you take too long to deal with them, they will enrage and start nuking probably your healers. And also you can only DPS the boss so low. I believe it's 37%. He's going to shield up, at which point you're done doing anything in this phase until you deal with the turrets. So first, let's talk about everything for Nahut specifically, and then we'll talk about turrets. So this is my attempt to graphically display what we're trying to do as simply as I can, which is that you see the pattern where we're going to drop 4 distortions around each generator station, 1 on each side, 1 down the stairs, 1 up against the little support arm there at the edge of the platform, and then we move and drop them on the others. And then we rotate over to the next generator station. DPS and healers are positioned with their backs to the generator station so that when they get pulled in, they don't lose uptime, they don't get pulled into a blue puddle, they don't get pulled in front of the boss and take a cleave to the face, and fairly easy to deal with. Now, the other thing that's nice about this is the timing for it works really well in that every other mass distortion is going to happen just before a gravity. So what this means is that the tanks are actually only ever going to stand moving from those kind of support arm to support arm to support arm. You can move in whatever pattern you like. I prefer counterclockwise for whatever reason, is the way I've always done it. But you could do it whatever direction you want. Just keep doing it the same direction. And so what will happen is the very first one is at that tank marker, I would hold the boss, and you'll see this played out in real time in a moment. I'll hold the boss, I'll get mass distortion, and then right after that, the gravity pull will happen. I'll get pulled down just below the stairs. I'll just stand there, and at that time, the tank, they can either do it just before the pull, or they can wait until just after the pull. Then they taunt the boss, and then they go back to where I was standing. And so then what happens is the first distortion gets dropped on the stairs, and then they hold the boss against that support arm. When they get mass distortion, I move over to the side, and then I taunt the boss. They drop distortion over there, and then I hold him at the next one, again, until the gravity. So what this means is, effectively, the two tanks are going to do the same thing every time. One tank is always going to be the one taking distortion, being pulled inward and dropping distortion at the lower level, and the other one is always going to take distortion up top. So let's see this in real time. Okay, so I'm going to play this at about half speed just to make it easier to describe. So there we've got Nahut. Again, I'm going to back up. I'm taking him at first. So I'm going to pull him to this kind of support arm deal, and I'm just going to hold him there so that the cleave doesn't hit anyone. You see there's the graphic indicator. I've already got mass distortion, so the other tank, you can grab him initially like my co-tank did there, or you could wait. It kind of is a bit of a preference as to what's easier. And so I'm going to stand there. Everyone else is moving inward. I drop mass distortion, and then I'm going to get repositioned immediately because there went mass distortion just now, as you noticed. And so then I'm going to taunt the boss. I'm going to pull him through the group before he does his cleave, and the other tank's going to stand at their position until they drop distortion, and then they're going to get repositioned to grab him. And again, I'm going to hold him here. I was the one that got pulled before. Same thing's going to happen. The boss is going to do mass distortion here in just a moment, and then I'm going to take it. I'm going to stand there and wait. Then we're going to get the gravity pull. So there, I've got mass distortion, so I'm not moving. Immediately after that, there's the gravity and the energized slice. That's the main thing, is you want to make sure if you're the other tank, you don't taunt and turn the boss to the group with that energized slice, because that just really hurts. It hurts tanks really bad, DPS as well. So then I drop the puddle here, and then I'm going to move across the way. Same deal as before. Maybe I throw 1 or 2 GCDs of damage. There's mass distortion. So now I'm going to taunt the boss, and now we're going to pull him across the way. And we're just going to, as tanks, that's all we're going to do is rinse and repeat that pattern until we push to phase 4 once we've dealt with turrets. If you're melee range DPS or healers, you can see they're getting repositioned moving between generator stations. But otherwise, all they're really doing is they're DPSing, they're healing, and they're doing the candle mechanic. That's the most important thing here. That's that group's primary responsibility. By this point, people are dealing with turrets, which let's actually talk about now. Okay, so turrets can spawn. They effectively have kind of fixed locations. They typically will spawn either on the bridges, as you can see here, or they'll spawn kind of in the middle of the bigger platform areas. These are the 6 most common locations for them to spawn. Now, it's important to understand they come in waves. So the first wave, and you'll see there's an announcement for it that reinforcements have arrived or whatever, and then one will spawn. The first wave of reinforcements will be 1 turret. Then after a little while, the second wave of reinforcements will come, and that's going to be 2 turrets. And every wave after that's going to be 2 turrets. And so the way that you deal with this phase is similar to story mode, where your objective is to get 5 turrets sucked into the singularity in the middle. Now, what's different is in story mode, as soon as you damage them below, as soon as you get them below 40% to 39, they shield themselves, they stop doing damage, they stop doing anything in the next gravity pull, and they just get sucked in automatically. In hard mode, it's not that easy. So in hard mode, they have a buff that protects them that basically makes them immune to any stuns or CCs, and that immunity goes way below 40%. but when they're active, they are still immune to gravity. So the only way to make this work in hard mode is you have to damage them below 40%, and then you have to stun them during the gravity pull-in so that they get sucked in. And you have to do that with 5 turrets. Now, the other thing you also need to be aware of is that these turrets really can hurt in hard mode. In story mode, it's not really a big deal. In hard mode, it very much is a big deal. So you need to be aware of how to use your defensives and interrupts to deal with this. So the basic mechanic to this is that they do their rail shot cast, 7-second cast. It has a very short cooldown. And as they cast rail shot, every time they use it, they get debuff. They get a buff called powering up that increases its damage and accelerates its cast time. Now, once they've used 10 rail shots, they have 10 stacks of powering up. In other words, if they've been up too long and you haven't gotten rid of them yet because you're too slow or you mess up something, then they get this fully charged buff. And that's when things are about to get serious. Because at that point, not only do they have a lot of stacks, meaning that each attack is ordinarily doing a lot more damage and casting a lot faster, now they also have a buffed Railgun Snipe that applies that Railgun trauma debuff that we saw in Phase 2, which basically means if one person takes 2 consecutive shots, they're dead. So things get really, really south. And also, you can LOS them prior to them getting this fully charged buff. Once they're fully charged, it basically is the same as Nahut's version from earlier, where it shoots you through anything. There's no LOSing it. You either have to be able to cheese it with a defensive that completely mitigates the damage, or you will take maybe 1 shot and survive, maybe, and the second one you're dead. So this basically means there's kind of a built-in enrage timer where as these turrets come up, you need to deal with them fairly quickly. You can't take forever to deal with them, or before you can get 5 of them pushed, some of them will start to enrage and kill people. Okay, so let's see Phase 3 from the perspective of in this case, me. I'm a DPS player, and I'm going to help with turrets. So I'm on turret duty for this. So I'm at that top 2 of the DPS, whereas the bottom half of our raid frame, the way we organize it, they're dealing with the candle. So early on, again, you're only going to get 1 candle in the first wave. So there is a wave of reinforcements arrive. You can see, I always look to my mini-map, so I can see the red dot is due east. And so the other DPS you can actually see on the minimap isn't even near us in the first place because they're going to be the person that deals with the first turret. So they're already over there dealing with it. I don't peel off until the second wave of turrets comes up. Now, got to continue dealing with Candle. Here we had a little bit of a mix-up where we had to wait a second to pass it. That's why it's important to keep on top of this. Although that's going to happen. Don't beat yourselves up. Mistakes happen. The key thing is just get it dealt with. Depending on your group DPS, it can actually be helpful to have the second DPS kind of do a little DPS and then peel off just a little bit to help. And so then we got the Singularity is slightly destabilized after consuming a rail turret. So the other DPS did a great job and pushed their rail turret. So now there's 2. So I go southwest, so I'm dealing with this. You'll notice it has 2 stacks, and there it's casting its rail shot. It is interruptible, so I interrupt the first one. Jugs are amazing for this. Now I don't quite have it pushed far enough here, and so I could leap interrupt it, but then I'd get pulled in. So instead I use Saber Reflect. And now I'm going to go back in. I'm just doing damage. The goal here is to get it below 40%. Once you get it below 40%, stop dealing damage. You do not want to kill it, and you can. Otherwise, I'm just going to interrupt it. I'll use my leap interrupt. I'll use my regular interrupt to avoid taking crazy damage. And all I'm doing is waiting. So there it is. There's the graphic. So I'm going to hit my stun. You got to know how long your stun lasts, and boom, it gets sucked in. There you can see the graphic. We got it twice. So that means we sucked in 2 turrets. So that's great. We've gotten these, and you'll notice the wave of reinforcement comes after each gravity. So we're literally getting rid of these about as quickly as they spawn. So we're doing really nice. We've gotten 3 so far. And so myself and the other DPS, we just got to get these 2 pushed, and then we're good. Now I don't quite kind of get it here. I try to use my AoE stun. Unfortunately, the AoE stun breaks on damage, and I'm a dot-based class. So that would work if if I weren't applying any dots. If this wasn't vigilance, if this was maybe if I were on rage or focus, maybe it would have worked. So just know your abilities. Sometimes the cooldowns make it tougher for others. So all I'm doing is literally I'm just waiting. I don't want to kill it. Now here it is. I'm just barely gonna have time, so I'll hit it with my stun with the graphic, and boom, there it goes. And we got another one. The Singularities become critically unstable. That means you got 5, and now you're pushed to Phase 4. Now, real quick, the other just things to note, other couple tips and tricks. If you're a class that has a CC, you can use a CC, but be very, very careful because, as you may recall, if you CC something, it heals, which means if you've got it at 38% and you hit it with a CC, it may heal above 40, and then it will regain its buff, making it immune, and then it won't get sucked in. So if you're going to do a CC, you're going to want to damage it a lot lower, get it to like 10, 15, 20% or something, so that you've got enough cushion that you can CC it and it won't have time to heal enough. So stuns are preferable. Make sure to take utilities for your stuns and all that fun stuff so that you have them up. If you, again, you'll notice there was one wave, my stun wasn't quite off cooldown, so we had to wait. That's okay, but just make sure you're getting through it. The key here, if you're dealing with turrets, is to make sure that you, it takes you no more than two pull-in cycles to get a turret. If you're doing that at that pace, you go get your turret, there's a pull-in while you're still damaging it, and the next pull-in, it gets sucked in, then you'll be doing just fine. It's when it takes 3 or 4 that now other turrets start to spawn and they get that fully charged buff, and then they'll start nuking probably your healers. So it takes a little practice, but pretty easy. Again, the key is just get them below 40, wait for that graphic, and hit it with that stun, and you'll be good to go. All right, so real quick before we move on to phase 4, which will also go pretty quickly, I just want to show, again, similar to story mode, Nahut does eventually shield, as I mentioned. In veteran mode, it's a little higher. I believe it's 37%. We're going to see it here in a second. So we've got him at about 40. We're getting our way down into the mid 40s. It doesn't have, a lot of this depends on your DPS, right? So like what we found prior to 6.0 with our group's DPS is that if we pushed him below, we could get him into the mid, below 50 was maybe doable, because it is functionally, there is a maximum amount of time you have to get to kill Nahut once you push to burn. So you don't want him to be too high. Ideally, you get him to the shield around the time you pull. Kind of depends on your DPS. For us, we found pre 6.0, we needed to be below 50 and probably more like the mid 40s. So you can see here we got him to 37%. So you hopefully saw that he was shielded. Let's take a closer look at that. Okay, so again, here's just a screenshot of what that looks like. So here we've got him, here he's shielded. He has the purple shield around him. He's also got the, if you look at his buff bar there at the bottom of the screenshot, you can see the kind of blue and white buff indicates he's shielded. He won't take more damage. This screenshot's actually from story mode at 34%. In veteran mode, it is 37% when he shields. And so what we found generally is if you have one DPS that goes straight away to turrets, either that spreads out initially straight away, or that stays on the boss and peels off immediately, and then the second DPS peels off with the second wave. Usually we found that for the most part you get him shielded either 15, 20 seconds before you push the last turret, or that maybe you don't quite get him shielded, but he's at like 40, 39, 40, whatever. That's fine. The main thing to be aware of, where you might need to rebalance your group, is if you're either, if you're having trouble getting turrets down quickly enough where it's taking an extra cycle beyond what you think, then you might shield him. He might be shielded a long time. If that happens, you might consider having maybe a third DPS peel off, and then and you might in that case need one of your tanks to help with the candle strategy. Or maybe what you do is you just, as soon as, like if you have a ranged DPS or a melee DPS with great movement, as soon as they pass the candle, if there is a rail turret that's nearby, they'll go peel off, do like 6, 7, 8, 10 GCDs of damage to that rail turret, and then come back to the boss. They're not taking a ton of time off, but they're doing a little bit of damage just to help those DPS push one gravity cycle earlier. The other thing that may be the case is if the opposite's happening, where maybe your DPS are just getting those turrets like every cycle where you don't skip one, it's the very first one, and you're pushing the boss at like 50, 55 or something, then you might explore whether maybe reshuffling your DPS as to who's doing what, or maybe literally just telling your DPS that are dealing with turrets to just wait one cycle. To make sure, because you definitely want to get him at least into the low 40s. In 6.0 with Veteran's Edge and higher DPS levels and easier DPS checks in veteran mode, for the most part, shouldn't be a big deal. You can come from behind a little bit if you need to, but just things to think about. Ideally, you want those to be happening within about 15, 20-ish seconds of each other, otherwise you might kind of tinker with things. But anyway, on to phase 4. Okay, so here's a graphic that I think is really helpful. I originally made this graphic for story mode. The one thing to note, this is everything here is essentially accurate for veteran mode as well, except for you do actually have to deal with the candle and the stealth mechanic. In story mode, he gains a buff that basically shorts out his shielding ability. In veteran mode, that does not happen. So the folks that are doing the candle need to continue doing the candle. And you could argue this is the most important time to keep track of it because you are effectively on a timer where you'll run out of room to stand and you've got to have him dead by then. And going through significant downtime of 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 20 seconds where you can't damage him is a pretty significant loss of uptime. Otherwise, everything else here is accurate for veteran mode as well. Again, as soon as you push him wherever he's positioned, you're going to get 25 seconds where he just doesn't do anything. He just basically stands there. This is intended so that if you have DPS at kind of at the opposite ends of the platform, they have time to get back to Nahut. So that everyone's positioned where they need to be as you actually properly start. So that 25 seconds is kind of an interlude or a transition phase, I guess you could say. Ideally, you have everybody back there, or at least all the DPS, but hopefully maybe one, so that you just have a really big burn. This is the best time if you raid buffs are maybe back up by now if you use them in the opener. So this is the best time to hit them in your adrenals because after this 25 seconds, you're going to be moving quite a bit. And so naturally, it's tougher to have as high of DPS. So this is time to unload. Now, after the 25 seconds, what's going to happen is the platforms are going to start to fill with lightning. Each big platform, there are 3 big platforms, is divided into 4 sections. They're divided at the midway point, and they're divided along the generator stations as noted by the white lines here. And so what'll happen is whichever section Nahut is standing on will fill with lightning. And so the way that you have to do this is you pull Nahut to the far edge. And so here we've got him positioned, and you see the little boxes here of how you want to be positioned, where you pull Nahut just right to the edge of that section, but where everybody else is standing in the next section, so that when that area fills with lightning, nobody's standing in it. Or maybe just the tank is standing in it, but only just barely, because it deals a lot more damage in veteran mode. It's a lot trickier to avoid cleaving anybody because everyone's moving, and so you really need to be ahead of it. In story mode, you can kind of willy-nilly it and run through lightning, and it's doable. In veteran mode, this is really important to really practice so that you don't lose people early and burn. DPS and healers, if you're a healer or ranged DPS, you should be as far ahead of the boss as you can get. So that you don't have any need to be near him. Melee DPS, you got to watch your feet. The other thing to note as well is watch your step on the bridges. Don't die from the bridges. The gravitic storm, the red line that expands as you make your way about 2/3 of the way through the platform. Once you get onto that last section, that'll really start to crowd you. So watch your step. The other thing that's important that you'll note in the video is that the tank gets a slow effect by the boss. And so what we found was very useful was we would have tanks piggyback where one tank, so in this position, you see that at the top left, the tank's positioned there. We would have the other tank positioned at basically almost at the very next spot. And as soon as the lightning goes out, they taunt the boss and pull him directly there. That way the other tank can just focus on moving as quickly as they can, and that lets you reposition Nahut a little faster and get him positioned so he doesn't cleave everyone. And then you just work your way around the room. Once you get the positioning right, and as long as the candle rotation goes smoothly, this is pretty much the easiest phase as long as you go into it with Nahut in that high 30s, low 40s health range. So anyway, let's see it live now that we've kind of talked through the strategy. Okay, here we go. This is actually end of phase 3. So again, as tanks, we're moving him back and forth based on the mass distortion. You can see here he's shielded. We've got him to 37%. So at this point, all we need to deal with turrets and getting them pushed. We're pretty close here. I think we're going to push right around this last gravity. Gravity does go away once you push to phase 4, as I did mention. So here it is. Singularities become critically unstable. That's your key. So now the boss, he is going to do like his basic attack, his energized slice. He doesn't, I guess, do nothing. But there are no other mechanics. So everyone's grouping up here. Our groups together. We've hit a lot of our raid buffs. We do have to keep using our candle, but otherwise we're just wailing on him. So now I'm getting positioned because we're going to get the lightning here momentarily. We probably could have repositioned him. He's in the middle. So I'm going to taunt the boss. And again, the midway point is the middle of the platform in the generator. So I'm going to pull him right to the generator. You don't want to pull him too far, especially in hard mode. And I get him positioned so that I can take the damage. My other tank is going to taunt as soon as, so there's the lightning. You'll notice the target there at the bottom. The other tank grabbed him. Right at the edge of the platform there, what you can do is actually stand on the little ramp. So again, there's the lightning. I'm going to taunt the boss. I'm going to pull him across there. That way everyone else can get positioned quickly. Again, don't want to quite pull him past the generator. Better to be safe than sorry. I can stand a little lightning. There we go. Again, cross taunt, and that's it, guys. It's pretty easy once you know where to hold him, so people aren't standing in lightning. You notice the range DPS and healers doing a really nice job of staying 15, 20, 25 meters ahead, which makes this really easy on the healers, where for the most part all they really have to do is heal the tank that's taking damage, and that's it, which makes it easy for them to help add DPS. And especially in 6.0 with damage being what it is, you'll kill him like before you're more than about halfway. So there you go. Like that was like 5 or 6, maybe 7 out of 12. So like we were halfway. Okay, let's see it one more time just from the perspective of a DPS. So same deal. You're wanting to get in positioned. If your tanks have really good movement abilities, force speed is particularly awesome. Usually you don't quite have enough cooldowns for one person to solo tank him. And because of the slow, it can make it tougher to get him positioned, and then you're pulling him towards the group. So here I'm part of the candle rotation, so I got to keep doing my job on melee DPS. So I'm behind the boss. I'm just watching that debuff. Oh, it's getting low, so I'm going to go ahead and do my suppress, and boom. Then I need to pass it to the next person, so I do that. So got to keep that cycle up, but otherwise we're just wailing on the boss. Here the positioning is maybe not quite perfect. It's not a big deal if you're melee DPS in particular. Just if you see lightning, you need to get out of it first. You got to stay alive. If you have all 8 people up, and if you were able to clear the DPS checks for Tithe and Avail and Esne, if you have everyone up, you should have no problems with this DPS check, as long as Nahut is visible the entire time, and as long as you don't lose anybody. So again, I'm moving out a little early, given that we're not tanking him quite as close, which is fine. And otherwise, just keep the candle rotation, and we're DPSing him, and that's it, guys. It takes a little practice in burn phase, but it's honestly probably the easiest cycle through. We lose somebody due to lightning damage, and that's a tank. So just that that he hits pretty hard, but not a big deal. We could res him here, I think, if we wanted to. I think we don't for one reason or another. But anyway, that's it. Really, really fun fight. Nahut's probably my favorite fight in here. Because it's not quite as crazy with 500 mechanics as Isaac's, but otherwise I like it a lot. So hope this is helpful. Sorry it's really, really long. Again, use the chapter tags to help navigate through, because I know this is a long graphic. Here at the end, we lose track of, oh gosh, are we going to kill him? Yep, we got plenty of time, and we get him down, no problem. So anyway, hope this is helpful. Appreciate you watching the video guides. Hope this is helpful in your own progression. Thanks so much, and have a good one. Bye.
Son of Shadow, stand down! Mortals, let us play a game. Let me tear into you. Your siblings thought the same. Now they lie in ruin. Son of Shadow, stand down! Mortals, let us play a game. Let me tear into you. Your siblings thought the same. Now they lie in ruin. have taken my last child from me. Now your true test begins.